Blood satellite.
Everything becomes synthesized. And we sort of discussed this when we were talking about the idea of trauma, but this is also sort of a Hegelian dialectical idea that anything you entertain just becomes a part of you. And I would always tell people this. I warn young guys of this, like Gen Z guys who are into playing around with, sometimes we're bad at this, at doing gay jokes, right? I get that. But they take it a bit too far by pretending to be trans and just saying too much gay shit. And it's ironic. Okay. But I said, look, anything that's expressed ironically on a long enough timeline just becomes your reality. And this was known back in the 4chan days when, like, if you're posting trans porn and gore and things like that to spook people or chase them away, eventually you just become a guy with a 13 gigabyte trans porn folder.
It's irony poisoning because I think it just becomes a habit, right? You do it often enough, and then if people try to look, the fact that when we criticize these guys, the fact that they defend it rather than the first thing out of their mouth saying, like, look, I get it, I understand why you would hate this, it's obviously gay and dumb, but it's a joke. But they don't say that. They immediately defend it. They say, oh, you're just a fuddy-duddy boomer prude who just doesn't like funny jokes. So the fact that you have that kind of defensive reaction to it shows that it's already got its tentacles into your fucking brain.
And I say this to them, not to mock them, but to warn them. I say, be cautious. I've seen people being led astray by this. If you entertain this sort of degeneracy, it will take root because you synthesize whatever you do. People are what they do every day.
All day doing it. Exactly. That's exactly what I'm trying to say. You do it all day long. It doesn't matter whether you consciously think it's a joke or not. If you do it all day long for a year, then it's just you. There's no distinction between whether it was a joke or authentic. It's all authentic after 12 months.
There's this line from the villain in John Wick 4. I should have just made up a different movie this was from, but I actually really like I've come to really like John Wick 4, but because I didn't used to like it that much. But the villain in that, he just has this line of how a person does anything is how they do everything. And I really think about that a lot because we have these grand ideas of how we want to be portrayed, but on a granular everyday level, if you are an undisciplined person in your finances, or if you're sloppy in your eating habits, you're kind of sloppy in everything else. You just have this dream that one day I will be perfect. But it's like, no, you actually start with sharpening your pencils and making sure you have your keys with you. Little things like that. This is
the basis of why we write off people who are like fat or dirty or don't take care of themselves. Like this has been around for 1,000 years. It's because if you can't bother to shave, brush your teeth, and lift weights once in a while, you probably are not somebody I can trust with anything.
Yeah. And so I really became obsessed with like everything matters. Everything is synthesized or incorporated into you. So you should be careful about what little things you do and what maybe degeneracies you permit, or what excuses you make for yourself, because those become codified over time. And this is my way to segue into the book I wanted to discuss, which I knew you were very excited about. And it's actually it's a very fascinating book. You can really get through the thesis of it pretty fast, and I agree with it. And there's quite a bit of history included in this book, but we actually could get through it pretty fast, and I would encourage people to read it. The book, of course, is The Germanization of Early Medieval Christianity, and this is a book that really pairs well with the last few books that we've covered, and it really is the idea of synthesis. It's this idea, it's looking at the proselytization of the Catholic Church all throughout Europe, and we discussed this last episode too by saying, why did Christianity take root in certain European countries more than in Japan, in India, with the Jews? Because all this was attempted. They sent missionaries all over the place. And even those places where it does take root, in Africa, it's of a different character. Arguably, Africans don't comprehend Christianity the same way Europeans do. However, it really took root in France, in Germany. So what happened there? Why did that occur? And we're going to read some sections from the book, but if I had to explain it very simply, and I've actually had this book recommended to me by both Christians and pagans. or Christians and Hellenists, and a few different denominations of Christians as well, like Lutherans and Catholics and Eastern Orthodox. They like this book. Of course, it's these people are filtered from being in our space, so because there's like a racial aspect to it, I think people like it because of that. But it seems to have a wider audience than I thought. Anyway, the thesis is that as the Catholic Church was trying to convert the Germanic tribes, these sort of rural people, it had to make certain concessions. It actually couldn't stomp out all of their rituals or rites. They had to sell it. You have to sell it to the Germans. I'm doing a very rudimentary explanation of it here, and we'll get to it in more detail later. But the idea was you had to convince these people to adopt these fundamental Christian ideas. And the only way they could do that was by allowing certain elements and character of the German peoples to not only remain with those peoples, but to feed back into the church itself. So you see, as you know, there's that idea McLuhan talked about, that as you extend yourself, you must auto amputate yourself. Like as you, or as the empire, the imperium expands its borders, it must synthesize these new peoples, and they filter into the center. That's what the UK is seeing right now with India, or that's the claim Indians are making. But you saw this in Rome too. You end up with a multicultural problem because you need to integrate all these new types of people. The same thing with the church, but it was able to integrate these European peoples into the church, which over time, not only in Rome but also in Germany and elsewhere, it made, I'd say the Catholic Church specifically at the time, but Christianity widely in the West, much more of a European institution. There's a Europeanness to the church, which is interesting because the religion itself comes from the East. So how is it that this Eastern incursion into Rome, we might call it, took on such a profound European character? Well, this is one of the ways it did. And it had to make concessions to the character of the people, to the folkways. It had to incorporate a lot of these rituals. When people say like, oh, Christmas falls upon a pagan holiday or whatever, well, that is, there's truth to that. And there's truth to a lot of the just little things, and we'll get into what those little things are and what Germany brought to the table. But I'll just read from the book. First of all, actually, what do you think about that, what I just said?
Yeah, that's fascinating. Actually, I hadn't ever thought of it in that context before.
He says here, with all due I will say he writes it in a very frustrating way. The book is written almost like he wrote it and then put it into an LLM and said, make this sound smart, which is something I did once in the past just to test it out. I took a paragraph I wrote and I put it into an LLM and said, the exact prompt I gave was, make this look like it was written by someone with 190 IQ. And it spat it back out with just a lot of big words put in, and it just expanded every sentence out to 3 sentences and just bloated it, right? So I hate to say it, but there's quite a bit of bloating in this book. However, you know, I've tried to trim it down to what I think is the most essential. It says, with all due concern for the dangers of overgeneralization, right away, annoying way to start, the fundamental postulate. Oh man, it's kind of written like a parody. Anyway, the fundamental postulate derived from this model is that the worldview of the Indo-European, Greek, Roman, and Germanic religions was essentially folk-centered and world-accepting, whereas the worldview of Eastern mystery religions and early Christianity was essentially soteriological and eschatological, hence world-rejecting. Equally significant and related to this distinction is the assertion that the social structure of the Germanic peoples at the time of their encounter with Christianity reflected a high level of group solidarity, while the urban social environment in which early Christianity flourished was one in which alienation and normlessness or anime prevailed. For Christianity to be accepted by the Germanic peoples, it was necessary that it be perceived as responsive to the heroic, religio-political, and magical religious orientation of the Germanic worldview. So there's a lot in there. That's really the summary of his entire thesis. So one thing he's saying there is world accepting versus world rejecting. And what he talks about with the urban versus rural, a lot of theologians have pointed out that Christianity especially in Rome, seemed to thrive in urban environments where the normalcy was in flux. People had very materialist concerns. We talked about this even last episode, I believe, about how one of the with Christianity and classical culture by Cochrane, but by showing how Christianity actually spread, and there was a transition from a pagan way of thinking to a Christian way of thinking, right? And a lot of that was driven just by the collapse of the political structure in which people found most of their identity. Okay. And that seems to occur more in cities. You have the chaos, you have the subjugation, you have people confronted with collapse scenarios, and they seek this out. That is not the case in Germanic tribes. You're dealing with people who are very kin centric, folk centered, and it's very easy to be socially atomized in cities. And this was even the case back in Rome. Whereas in these tribes, you needed stronger networks to exist in a rural state, which meant that you could not propose Christianity the same way you could to an urban individual. You had to make it attractive. It's not obvious why they would even need this. They've got, even from a non religious perspective, you can't just use the exact same logic on these people. He continues here, he says, distinguishing between that which is essential to Christianity and that which may be modified or omitted to advance the process of Christianization has always been a major problem for the missionary. When Christian essentials are considered to include substantial elements of the proselytizing party's culture, the potential for alienating the target society is high. When Christian essentials are minimized and indigenous cultural and religious customs readily incorporated, the likelihood of religious syncretism increases. If the essence of Christianity is always in a state of flux, how can any particular form or belief or observance be deemed non Christian? A good question. The absence of well defined religious standards inevitably leads to imprecision and confusion, particularly since the characterization of any aspect of a religious development is non Christian is usually interpreted as negative. Therefore, whenever the notion of Christianization is discussed, a thorough effort should be made to determine the extent to which the distinctive soteriological, eschatological core of Christianity is consciously accepted. And this is something he gets into later on, which is that, look, a lot of Germans would be baptized. True, that's a ritual you can do. You're baptized and you're saved. But after you're baptized, do you actually live in a Christian way? The problem they are running into was they wouldn't. And I suspect the same thing was happening all throughout Africa. You can sell people on the idea of being baptized, but do they pray? Do they go to church? What is their involvement with that sort of community? Or is it just a thing you do because you're told that's important, right? So the missionaries, they said, we need to not only convince these people of baptism, but to adopt these core values. And to adopt the core values, you actually had to show concessions with a lot of the other rituals and values. But as long as you could transition them to a new way of thinking, as Cochrane had said. He continues here, the notion that baptism alone may be equated with conversion or Christianization is not considered acceptable from the perspective of this inquiry. Because, there's people who get baptized in China too, but are there a lot of, Chinese Christians? No. And eventually it goes away generationally as well. He kind of goes into it here as well. He says, recent scientific research has affirmed a genetic component to many individual personality traits, such as traditionalism, alienation, and aggressiveness. Now we know why so many of our guys like this book. Genetic factors are now claimed to account for approximately 50% of the individual differences in religious attitudes, values, and interests. If combined with the notion of group personality or syntality, these findings may contribute towards the development of a genetic approach to societal religious identity. If a society's religious attitudes and values are indeed shaped by genetic factors, the attempt by missionaries to alter them becomes more than a matter of religious conversion. Interesting. So it seems that the religion itself must take on an ethnic character. And as you adopt more ethnic identities, they must coincide with that. You know what I mean? So and I think the church, the Catholic Church for certain, but even more so Protestantism, because Protestantism, in my view, is the ultimate offshoot of European identity through Christianity. I think a lot of people would probably agree. Um, but I would also say the Catholic Church also maintains a lot of that ethnic identity as well, in the sense that if you are an African and you're being brought into the church, you must adopt that European worldview, which is also why Islam proposes such an issue, because that is an Arab centric worldview. If you become Islamic, if you are white and you become Muslim, you must adopt not only Arabic clothing and cuisine and their language, but also their behavior. You'll start seeing white people behaving like an Arab, which is a weird thing to see. I don't know why gingers take to it easier, but it just seems to be the case. He gives some examples here. He says, after Christianity has been introduced into a previously non Christian population, the process of syncretism often occurs. This process appears to accelerate in those scenarios where the initial impetus is essentially social or political, and it's not superseded by a deeper religious conviction or enhanced by instruction. The process of syncretism is especially apparent in the emergence of ethnic forms of Christianity, such as Voodoo in Haiti, Rastafarianism in Jamaica, Santiera in the Caribbean countries, and Macumba in Brazil. Examples of medieval Christo-Germanic syncretism may be found in the development of concepts of Eigenkrieg and for chivalry. Um, Says similarly, the Anglo-Saxon missionaries did not emphasize the central soteriological or eschatological aspects of Christianity, instead seeking to appeal to the Germanic regard for power. They tended to emphasize the omnipotence of the Christian God and the temporal rewards that would bestow upon those who accepted him through baptism and through conformity to the discipline of the church. The most significant factors in determining an appropriate missiological approach and in predicting missionary success appear to be the prevailing worldview of the target society, the degree of popular satisfaction with the indigenous religion, the level of target society or socio-cultural cohesion, and others. So what he presents there is an interesting idea. It's that Christianity seems to succeed insofar as it can integrate a lot of this sort of pagan worldview. And the pagan worldview, which is what many pagans try to return to, which is the worship of power and the focus on community, because that's something that the Germanic people may have brought to Christianity that was not there. It was more of an atomized urban thing. But it's like, no, we are community focused, we are power focused, and we are not obsessed, but we're concerned with heroism. So, as you see those characteristics feed back in the church, God becomes a bit more omnipotent. The sacrifice of Jesus becomes a bit more relevant than your individual obsession with reaching heaven. It becomes more world accepting. At the start, we said, Christianity was typically world rejecting. Forsake this world, forsake everything about it. None of it fucking matters. Stay focused on the divine, stay focused on heaven. They demand it to be more real. We must care more about this figure of Jesus Christ. We must care more about what occurs in the real world and how that forms communities. I think that's interesting. What do you think about all of that?
Yeah, it makes sense. Obviously, that's the way that it would have worked. I'm wondering how that affected it through time. Like this sound, we're talking about like just near the end of Rome, right?
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. And I do wonder if that character is what led to Protestantism, because I think you
That's
need
what I was thinking.
a
Yeah,
stronger conceptualization of who you are as a people to actually separate from the institution itself. So you're which is more powerful. We'll get to that in a future episode. There's this really fascinating book called The Disenchantment of the World that really deals a bit more with this. But you need a conceptualization of yourself as a people to really do that. And I think the interplay between these, the absorbing of these ethnicities is what led to that and made it less atomized. And so by saying, it adopted a pagan worldview isn't to say it just, deified demons or their gods or anything, but it did incorporate these folk ways and these kin rituals and the relevance of the community, because in Protestantism I think there is a focus on the church as the center of the community. And so there you have an acceptance of the relevance of the community. Why does the community even matter in a Christian context? It should just be your individual relationship with God or the hereafter, but it's not. Now it's this other thing. Now it has a concern with how to organize a tribe in a sense. And then you take that, and with that you can evolve, not evolve, poor choice of words, but branch off into Protestantism. But it's less of a reaction than you might think, because I do think in the original church you started to see that transformation already. um, he says the early medieval Germanization of Christianity, in most cases, was not the result of an organized Germanic resistance to Christianity or any attempt by the Germanic peoples to transform Christianity into an acceptable form. Rather, it was primarily a consequence of the deliberate inculcation of German religio-cultural attitudes within Christianity by the missionaries themselves. This process of accommodation resulted in the essential transformation of Christianity from a universal salvation religion to a Germanic and eventually European folk religion. So the transition from Christianity to a European folk religion is deeply interesting to me, because I do think that is true. I think a lot of people intuit that, but they don't say that outright, because some people will say, "Well, it's a fucking desert religion. You're worshiping a brown Jew." It's like, well, that's not what it is. If it was just that, it wouldn't have taken off.
Exactly.
The ethnic character of the Europeans seems to be a huge part of it, while maintaining, and this is important to say, while maintaining the core tenets of Christianity, and what I think, like, the essential skeletal structure of that. um, he goes on here, it says Germanic influence was largely responsible, according to this guy named Youngman, for an increased emphasis upon the dramatic and allegorical representation of events from the life of Christ in the Mass and in Scripture, as well as the weekly liturgical cycle and the simultaneous decline of soteriological eschatological emphasis in the liturgy and in artistic expression. Also related to Germanization was the emergence of Christmas festival cycles as a rival to the Easter cycle. Interesting. And an increased stratification of clergy and laity, represented by the growing distance between the altar and the faithful, as well as the introduction of a communion rail boundary at which the communions knelt. So it's little things like that. It's like the structure of the church, the distance or the stratification of the elites within the structure, which would have, not mirrored, but been influenced by the stratification of a tribal network as well. Everything's less free flowing. It is more hierarchical, which was not a feature of Christianity going back to the beginning. Not really. He says a common feature among the Germanic peoples is the development of a concept of collective security. This was closely related to two Germanic institutions, the family and kin group on one hand, and the personal lordship on the other. Collective security may be considered the antithesis to anomie. The religious movement which had flourished in the anomie urban quarters of a declining society was not likely to meet with immediate success in a rural emerging society with a high level of collective security, unless that religious movement was represented in a manner which was compatible with the worldview of a latter society. So again, returning to the idea that you're not approaching Christianity from a position of weakness. You're already in a position of strength. You have your security guaranteed through your tribe and kin network. So what is this thing offering? What is in it for me? And really, what do I benefit from changing the way I look at the world? So in these instances, I think it's not even manipulative. In some instances, you could be moving into an area of desperate people, but that's not the case here. And that's what makes it so interesting. It continues on, says, it appears that the primary sacral locus of most folk religions, including Indo-European religions, is the folk community itself. The sacrality of the community is expressed in ritual ceremonies that celebrate its relationship with its exclusive gods and promoting a strong sense of in group identification and loyalty. Historically, folk religions have usually been succeeded by universal religions. And I think that's the natural transition I'd like to focus on most of all, which is that it's not that these peoples, let's use the Germanic people as an example, it's not that they even really had to sacrifice much. They weren't stamped out, they weren't manipulated, they weren't brainwashed, really. It seems that they, of their own free will and their own, let's call it enlightenment, accepted this as long as certain concessions were made, but they did accept the new worldview. They did accept the word of God eventually. And so it's not oppressive in that sense. And insofar as that character remained and fed back into the church and created that true unity. He kind of goes into what we mean by world rejection here, and I think this is important, especially after we had wrapped this up soon. He says, world rejection, as used herein, is broadened to include not only an extremely negative evaluation of man and society, and the exaltation of the another realm of reality as true and infinitely valuable, but also attitudes of general indifference or opposition towards the socio-biological principle of group survival through in-group altruism. In China, resistance to the world rejecting elements of Buddhism was centered in the world accepting, socially reinforcing Confucian notions of ancestor and emperor worship, while in Japan, adherence to the predominantly folk centered Shinto worldview functioned similarly. Briefly stated, it's suggested here that the prolonged existence of these anomic social conditions in a folk religious society predisposes that particular society, to religious movements with prominent world rejecting tendencies. I like those examples there of here's why Buddhism struggled against Confucianism. And it's easy to understand why. World accepting and biology accepting versus world rejecting and a monastic focus on the
Yeah.
hereafter.
As a Westerner, they blend together, but if you're on the ground, they're almost polar opposites. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, he kind of continues on here, and this is what we discussed when we talked about Rodney Stark and the spread of Christianity to the elites, because that was an important function of its success, not just Constantine, but the aristocracy. He said the primary appeal of a universal religion to a ruling elite may be its potential as a force for enhanced social cohesion. Although further research in the area of sociopolitical and religious interaction is necessary, it appears that this utilitarian view contributed towards the popularity of Zoroastrianism throughout the Persian Empire by King Cyrus. In Alexander the Great's advocacy of Hellenistic ecumenism and the expansion of the Hinayana Buddhism during the reign of Indian Emperor Asoka, and the expansion of Buddhism throughout China during the Tang Dynasty as well. When the social order is disrupted by rivalry, political change, or military conquest, attempts to provide religious rationalization for these developments may provoke new modes of religious thinking. Think back to Cochrane. That's what we discussed there. In certain instances, the breakdown of internal order led to messianic expectations of the coming Savior King. Sound familiar? Sound like some people you know? Sound like some situations you might have found yourselves in? Waiting for the great philosopher king to come and unite us? Do you detect any messianic yearnings among these people that we know? And I like how he gives more of a overview of the Germanic peoples and what they were dealing with at the time, which might have inspired the acceptance of this. He says, since the early Germans could not rely on the protection and assistance of a bureaucratic empire when they were threatened with attack or famine, it was incumbent upon each man and woman of the community to adhere to the fundamental socio-biological principle of group survival embodied in the bonds of familial and communal solidarity. One's status in society depended upon how closely one adhered to this fundamental principle. Those who behaved honorably, thereby contributing to the advancement of the community, were materially rewarded. Instead of directly confronting this opposing value system and attempting to radically transform it, the missionaries apparently sought to redefine the Germanic virtues of strength, courage, and loyalty in such a manner that would reduce their incompatibility with Christian values, while at the same time enculturating Christian values as far as possible to accommodate the Germanic ethnos and worldview. And he continues here, the pre-Christian Germanic values retain acceptance in Western European Christian circles in the 13th century, seems to indicate that as Christianity expanded to include the Germanic peoples, some of its core values, such as world-rejecting notions of honor, its pacifism, and its focus on individual posthumous salvation, were substantially transformed in a process of Germanization. Whatever attitudes Christians may have had towards actual physical violence, they found the images of Christian moral struggle in their heroic life. Stock phrases describe the combat with the world, the flesh with the devil. Military terms designate the saintly hero. Thus, even though military imagery may serve to invoke specific images, such as the victory of good angels over the demons or Christ's resistance to temptation, its non-Christian and pre-Christian prototypes show that the heroic image had its own coherence. One reason for the formidable impact of pre-Christian Germanic values on medieval Christian culture was that substantial Germanic contribution to the development of the feudal system. So again, just summarizing, here's some areas of focus that appealed to the Germans, and those elements were heightened in Christian culture as Germanic values fed back in to the central church. Um, and I'll just end on this note because I know we got to get going soon. It says the acceptance of Christianity could not possibly cause the old Germanic mode of thinking to lose its power overnight. This mentality took centuries to overcome and still has some appeal today. Characteristically, the stories of the conversion of the Frank Clovis and the Lombard Romuald represent God's guidance to the fortunes of battle and as the decisive elements in the turning of Christianity. Moreover, ethics and religion were separate in Germanic paganism, so that the supplanting of the pagan by the Christian cult did not simultaneously imply a change in the realm of ethics. Interesting. The reception of Christianity in the Mediterranean world might have been much the same as the Germanic world had it not been for the anomic folk dissolving effect of the Hellenistic transformation, which disrupted the intimate and stabilizing relationship between socio-political and religious spheres that had existed in the Greek polis and the Roman gens. So, again, it's a very, I'd argue, simple thesis expressed at length. There's a lot of great examples, a lot of historical depth to this, but I think the case is very clear and very strong that Christianity survived and took on a distinct European character by absorbing these folkways that redefine the character of the church.
Yeah.
What do you think about all that? I know
Well,
you were
that
excited for
point at the end was interesting. That saying the way that it part of the strength of it was the way that it later integrated into the feudal system, because this was happening at the same time as the birth of the feudal system. So you've got that period between beginning of the feudal system, beginning of the Catholic Church, Holy Roman Empire, and you've got little by little, almost by not, I wouldn't say by accident, but you've got the church is getting itself weaved into all of these systems, which, and I think the feudal system for that period was the most effective thing that they could have done. So it was fantastic that it happened to be associated with Christianity at that point, right?
Like within Rome, you have Christianity standing apart from the Roman Imperium.
Right.
But then how does it come to take on this very hierarchical, institutional, arguably militaristic structure over centuries, over a long time? But I'm like, the only way you get there is by absorbing these cultures that have a very deep appreciation and obsession with communal bonds and community structure and mapping onto the real world. Like, I don't think you get the structure of the Catholic Church as we know it without incorporating all of these folkways, because as we've seen, historically there was perhaps even more of a there was always Christian communities even in Rome. There was always and there was this great point, and we'll get to this in the next episode, when we talk about disenchantment of the world. But there was, I believe even Cochrane talked about this, but I didn't bring it up. But it was saying one of the ways that Christianity was so popular was because it found a way to incorporate all of those who felt that they were not rejected, but they weren't being granted what they feel that they deserved by Roman society. So you might have even had sensitive young men. You might have had people who had a weird sort of genius, right? But they were just didn't fit in. They were maybe had some antisocial tendencies, but maybe they represent some other good genetic stock. Now they could absorb into this thing, which was already setting up its own parallel society. That's what Christianity represented. It was like a parallel society against Rome. But then how did these very loose, very fluid parallel societies take the form of this much more rigid organization? And I think this is how you do it. And you can only do that if you adopt a worldview that is not monistic, which is not just world rejecting. And again, just to circle back to that really the central point here is that you go from the world rejecting nature of this mystery cult religion into something that is world accepting, that is, if not explicitly pagan, but pagan in spirit or communal in spirit, which makes it not just an atomized individualistic, religion.
Do not let the rapists win. Listen and love Blood Satellite.